Okay, so this is Lecture 7, Organized Politics, Interest Groups, and Political Parties. As per our normal practice, I'd like you to probably pause the recording here and copy down your key terms list. Okay, let's get started. In the last lecture, we saw how public opinion is formed, and we discussed the various influences through which people acquire their political beliefs and attitudes. But having a political belief system is one thing. Acting on it is another thing entirely. In order to actually affect change in society, people have to organize themselves into groups through which they promote the causes and the solutions in which they believe. Without such groups or organizations, your individual beliefs don't matter all that much. But with them, with organizations or groups, you can affect change by pressuring politicians or perhaps electing new politicians to bring about change in your society, the type of change that you believe in. With that in mind, there are basically three major ways in which people organize themselves to bring about political change in their society. The first is by creating or joining a political party. A party is a group of people with similar political values or beliefs who organize together for the purpose of supporting candidates for political office, winning elections, and thereby, hopefully, controlling or influencing the policies of the government. That is the most essential point to remember about parties. The purpose of a party is to win elections. Now, today, we have two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. You see their symbols right here on the slide. The symbol for the Democratic Party is the donkey. The symbol for the Republican Party is the elephant. There's a whole long backstory as to why those are their symbols. We don't need to get into that. But in the past, we've had several other major political parties. We've had the first two political parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Then we had the Whigs and the Democrats, the Populist Party, the Progressive Party, and so on. And we'll talk about these when we talk about the history of political parties. The second way that people organize themselves to bring about political change is through interest groups. Like a party, an interest group is an organization created to advance the political beliefs or values of its members. Unlike a party, an interest group does not nominate candidates to compete in elections, nor does it draft a party platform or try to win elections by electing its members. That's the key difference between a party and an interest group. An interest group is not created primarily for the purpose of competing in and winning elections. Now, an interest group may support candidates from one or both of the major parties who happen to support its views. But its primary purpose is to bring about political change by other methods, such as persuading the general public to embrace its views. And one of the purposes of interest groups is to persuade the people that they are correct about the issues that they care about. Also by endorsing candidates from one or both of the political parties if those candidates happen to agree with their views. And thirdly, by lobbying. Lobbying is basically trying to convince political office holders to support their legislative priorities, the policies that they want to see enacted. And then the third way that people have of organizing themselves to bring about political change is through so-called social movements. Now, we're not going to talk about social movements in this lecture all that much. I just want you to be aware of what they are. Many parties and many interest groups have grown out of what are called social movements. A social movement is different from a party or an interest group in that a social movement is not an organization per se. Rather, a social movement consists of a broad group of people sharing a common ideology or political belief system who want to see certain general changes brought about in their society. Two examples of a social movement would include the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement flourished in the United States from about 1830 to 1860, and it was a movement to abolish slavery throughout the United States, which ultimately it succeeded in doing by passing the 13th Amendment to the United States in 1865, which forever abolished slavery as a legal institution in this country. And then there's the civil rights movement, the mid-20th century civil rights movement, which we talked about earlier when we talked about civil rights. It flourished in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, and it was a movement to grant full civil and political rights to African Americans and to overthrow the Jim Crow system. So those are two examples of a social movement. In the United States today, there are more than 200,000 interest groups that have been organized to represent various constituencies throughout the country. Now, these interest groups come in all shapes and sizes. There are four major types of interest groups that you need to be aware of. They are economic interest groups, environmentalist interest groups, public issue or public interest groups, and also single issue interest groups. First off, let's talk about economic interest groups. The most common type of interest group is an economic interest group. These are interest groups created by a group of people with a common financial or economic interest that they want the government to do something about. They have a common financial, or another way of saying it would be a business motive for organizing together and pushing their agenda with the government. Economic interest groups are so common that you really have to break them down into four major subtypes. The first would be business interest groups. These are interest groups that represent businessmen and or corporations. You can also say businessmen or businesswomen and or corporations that have a common interest to promote. Examples include the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has about 3 million member businesses, the National Association of Manufacturers, etc. There are also agricultural interest groups. These are interest groups of farmers and or agribusinesses. They represent primarily the agricultural sector of the economy. They include such businesses as the Farm Bureau, which was founded in 1919 and represents about 5.5 million farm families. And agricultural interest groups, although they only represent about 1% of the population, because only about 1% of the population is engaged in agriculture as their primary means of support, they have nevertheless succeeded in getting massive farm subsidies for farmers passed by Congress. The federal government gives about $20 billion a year in farm subsidies to farmers around the country. So even though agricultural interest groups don't have a whole lot of people that they represent, they have major clout on Capitol Hill. There's also labor unions. Now, these are organizations of workers created to represent their members in negotiations with their employers and to lobby the government on behalf of their members' interests. Since the late 19th century, labor unions have been one of the largest and most active types of interest groups in the United States. Two modern examples of powerful labor unions include the AFL-CIO, which was actually created out of a merger of two different major labor unions. The AFL stands for American Federation of Labor, and CIO stands for Congress of Industrial Organizations. And today, the AFL-CIO represents about 10 million workers in diverse industries across the country. And then the other example would be the Change to Win Coalition, which is actually an alliance of many smaller labor unions collectively representing about 6 million members. And then the fourth type of economic interest group would be professional organizations. These are interest groups of so-called professional class workers. Another way of describing them would be white-collar workers. These are workers with some sort of special knowledge, training, or skill that makes them particularly valuable to their employers and or customers. For example, you have groups like the ABA. The ABA stands for the American Bar Association. It is the largest interest group representing lawyers in America. Also, the American Medical Association, which is the largest interest group for doctors. In addition to lobbying the government on behalf of their members, many of these professional organizations also act as de facto licensing agencies. They will issue entrance examinations to their members, which effectively license them to practice that profession. For example, if you want to become a lawyer and practice law as your profession, you'd better pass the bar examination. The bar examination is a test given by the ABA, specifically the different state chapters of the ABA. If you pass the bar examination in Missouri, then you are qualified to practice law in the state of Missouri. And so it's very difficult to practice a particular profession, like practice the profession of law without being a member of the ABA. So those are the four major types of economic interest groups. And again, economic interest groups are one major category in themselves. But then we have so-called environmentalist interest groups. Now, these aren't interest groups that represent people with a common financial motive or business motive. Instead, these are interest groups dedicated to protecting the natural or physical environment of the United States from abuse or neglect by modern society. That's the definition of an environmentalist interest group. The two oldest examples of this in the United States, or at least two of the oldest examples of this, would be the Sierra Club, which was founded over 120 years ago in 1892 to promote the creation of national parks and national forests and to protect the land that these entities existed upon. Then there's the National Wildlife Federation, which has more than 4 million members across the United States. This is an organization dedicated to protecting animals and particularly endangered species from destruction by humans. One of the accomplishments of the National Wildlife Federation was to get the federal government to create endangered species categories in order to protect certain endangered species from going extinct. We also have public interest groups. Now, public interest groups are interest groups formed in the public interest, meaning for the benefit of society at large rather than a specific constituency or a specific group of people. So at least supposedly, at least in theory, public interest groups represent everybody, not just one group. One example of this would be the Consumer Federation of America. This is a consumer advocacy group designed to promote the interests of consumers. Now, who are consumers? Everybody, right? Everybody buys stuff. Everybody eats stuff or wears stuff. So if you've bought anything in the last year, you are a consumer, which I'm assuming all of you listening to this have done. And The CFA is mainly concerned with protecting consumers from unsafe products or from being cheated by businesses. One of the CSA's first major accomplishments was to get the federal government to require seatbelts to be installed in all passenger vehicles across the country. And then lastly, we have single issue interest groups. These are interest groups composed of people especially concerned with a single important political issue that they care about more than anything else. Their members are often highly motivated to push their agenda on that issue, often to the exclusion of other concerns. And the best example of this would be either side of the abortion debate today. Um, in the abortion issue, there are two major interest groups that represent pro-life side and the pro-choice side. On the pro-life side, there's the National Right to Life Committee, or NRLC, and on the pro-choice side, there's the National Abortion Rights Action League, or NARAL. And these are people who are overwhelmingly concerned with the abortion issue first and last. So let's talk about the tactics of interest groups now. Because of their diverse array of agendas, interest groups have developed a wide variety of tactics over the years aimed at pursuing those agendas. But there are two general types of tactics of interest groups that you need to be aware of. The first would be direct tactics. Direct tactics are tactics whereby an interest group seeks to apply direct pressure or influence to lawmakers or policymakers to affect the decisions they make. Again, direct pressure on lawmakers or policymakers to affect the decisions that they make. These direct tactics include, first and foremost, lobbying. Now, lobbying is when representatives of an interest group meet with lawmakers and or politicians and try to persuade them to see things from the perspective of the group that they represent. Lobbyists are typically professional spokespersons. They're paid to do this job. They know their issue better than anything else. They're usually very good at communicating and persuading people to see things from their point of view. So their job is to be extremely well versed in the issue that is important to their employers. Although lobbyists often get a deservedly bad reputation for dishonest dealings, for often lying about the issues to the politicians or the press, they play an indispensable role in the legislative process because, first off, as I said, they know more about their issue than anybody else, so they have a certain degree of expertise that they can use to advise lawmakers on what type of policy to pass. But also, and this is one of the aspects of lobbyists that people aren't always familiar with, it's the lobbyists who read the bills. Members of Congress or members of state legislatures, they often don't read most of the legislation that they pass, which sounds crazy to us today. But you got to understand that members of legislative assemblies, whether it be the U.S. Congress or a state legislature, they handle an amazing volume of legislation every year. Every year, there are at least 10,000 bills reported to Congress. Most of them will never see the light of day. Most of them will never make it out of committee. And yet somebody has to read all of this legislation to at least give the lawmakers a summary so that they can understand what they are voting on. And oftentimes that job falls to the lobbyists. So members of Congress will bring in lobbyists to talk to them about bills, about why they should vote yay or nay. And in the course of that conversation, they get at least an idea of what they're actually voting on, because they can't read, millions of pages of legislation every session. There's no time to do it. Now, when we talk about the role of lobbyists in the legislative process, there is probably no better movie or no better pop culture resource for describing that role than the movie Thank You for Smoking. Thank You for Smoking is a film that came out about, I'm guessing about 10 years ago. It came out in 2005, so 12 years ago, as I'm recording this lecture in 2017. And it's a movie about a lobbyist for the tobacco industry, a guy by the name of Nick Naylor. And if you go to the folder where this video lecture is contained, you'll see that I have put a movie clip from the opening scene of the movie Thank You for Smoking, which shows Mr. Naylor appearing on one of these daytime television shows like the Oprah Winfrey Show, except it's not the Oprah show that is portraying here. But he is participating in a panel discussion. Pardon me, I'm running low on power. He's participating in a panel discussion of people interested in the tobacco issue, and all the other members of the panel are coming from anti-smoking groups. He's the lone representative of the tobacco industry in this discussion. I want you to watch that clip right now. You can pause this video and watch that clip and see how he did. All right, hopefully you all enjoyed that clip from Thank You for Smoking. It's a great movie to watch if you ever want to enjoy a movie about the political process, and particularly probably the best movie ever made about lobbyists, I can tell you that. Also maybe the only movie ever made about lobbyists. But another method that interest groups have of applying direct pressure to lawmakers and policymakers would be by publishing ratings. Interest groups can influence legislators by publishing report cards containing ratings of how those legislators voted. These ratings show the members of the interest group how many times individual legislators voted with or against that interest group on the issues that were important to them. All right? How many times did they vote with us? How many times did they vote against us? So, for example, the ADA, which is the Americans for Democratic Action, a prominent liberal interest group, it rates congressmen and senators on a 0 to 100 scale. In this instance, a 100 rating would be a very liberal lawmaker, a 0 would be a very conservative lawmaker. And likewise, the American Conservative Union, ACU, a prominent conservative interest group, also rates congressmen and senators on a 0 to 100 scale. A 100 rating in that case would be a very conservative lawmaker. A 0 would be a very liberal one. Campaign assistance is a third way that interest groups have of applying direct pressure to lawmakers. And it's perhaps the most effective tactic that interest groups use in pressuring lawmakers to make decisions that are friendly to their constituents. All politicians want to get reelected, right? You know that, I'm assuming. All politicians want to get elected and to be reelected as many times as possible. And so one of the ways that, if you're an interest group, that you have of influencing their decisions is by giving them support, by helping them get reelected. That could be through help with fundraising, raising money on their behalf, or getting your members to volunteer to work on their campaign. Now, you're only going to do this if they're supportive of the issues that you care about. If they're not supportive, then you will probably give campaign assistance to their opponents. But either way, you're attempting to influence the decisions that lawmakers make by working for or against them in their campaigns. Also have what are called indirect tactics, which basically involves trying to influence the behavior of lawmakers without directly targeting any particular one of them. The main purpose is to impress upon politicians the fact that a particular interest group has the ear of the general public on a given issue. So one example of this would be a letter writing campaign, where an interest group tells its members, write to your congressman or congresswoman, or write to your senator and tell them X, Y, and Z. Tell them, support House Bill 223 or to oppose House Bill 223. They also have advertising campaigns where interest groups fund mass media advertising on television and newspapers and magazines on radio, designed to sway the public in a particular direction on an issue, designed to sway the public to see an issue from their point of view. And if they're effective in doing that, they can also affect the policies that lawmakers put into place. Because, of course, again, lawmakers pay attention to public opinion. We know that. Okay, so we've talked about interest groups now. What about political parties? As I mentioned earlier, the basic definition of a political party is a group of people with similar political values or beliefs who organize together for the purpose of supporting candidates for office, winning elections, and thereby hopefully controlling or influencing the policies of the government. But let's expand on that definition here. Because their primary purpose is winning elections, parties are also A, coalitions of voters. The basic constituents of any political party are the voters who support it on election day. These are generally voters who share the basic ideology and or political philosophy espoused by the party. Parties are also coalitions of interest groups. Now, interest groups do not necessarily identify strongly with one party or another, but some interest groups do. For example, pro-life interest groups tend to be strongly Republican because the Republican Party is the more pro-life party in the American political landscape today, while environmentalist interest groups lean heavily to the Democrats. This is because certain interest groups find one party or the other more receptive to their viewpoint, which makes them more likely to support that party in turn. Parties are also coalitions of factions. Now, a faction is a smaller group within a party that shares some common interest, regional identity, or ideological perspective that isn't necessarily characteristic of the party as a whole. So a faction is a smaller group within a party. Two great examples of this would be on the Democratic side, the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus is an organization representing all African American lawmakers on Capitol Hill. And because almost all of them are Democrats, you could consider the Congressional Black Caucus to be a faction of the Democratic Party. On the Republican side, you have the Tea Party. It's almost exclusively Republican. It's very hardcore small government, limited government spending, etc. And you could consider the Tea Party to be a faction of the Republican Party. And lastly, parties are coalitions of politicians. Politicians are in the business of winning elections. We know that. And so it makes sense that they should band together to cooperate with one another in pursuit of that goal. That's what all politicians have in common. They all want to win elections, so they join political parties to help them get elected. If parties couldn't help them get elected, they wouldn't join. In contemporary American politics, political parties serve at least 5 basic functions. The first is recruiting candidates. recruiting candidates. In order to win, if you want to win, you've got to find good candidates to represent your party at election time. These are the 2012 candidates for President of the United States, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. I should probably edit this slide to show the 2016 candidates. Here you go. So the 2016 presidential candidates were, of course, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. After a long, intensive nomination process, the two parties settled on these candidates as the best possible representatives of their parties and the policies and the issues that they cared about. Again, they settled on these two candidates as the best possible representatives of their respective parties. Again, these were the best possible representatives. Just let that sink in. All right. So after recruiting political candidates, a second major function of political parties is organizing and running campaigns. This involves holding political rallies, raising money, holding voter registration drives, raising money, recruiting volunteers to work on campaigns, raising money, and oh yeah, raising money. There's a theme there, right? One of the most important jobs of any political party in helping candidates run their campaigns is giving them access to fundraising resources, because political campaigns cost a lot of money. Parties are also involved in creating policies, because parties have to give voters a reason to support their candidates on election day. They have to come up with attractive policies that address the interests and the needs and the desires of their constituents. One example of this is Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act. This was a piece of legislation created by the Democratic Party because it addressed the widespread desire on the part of their constituents to expand access to health care among the poor. A fourth function of political parties is running the government. To the extent that a party is successful in winning elections, it must also bear a proportional share of the burdens of running the government. In other words, if your party wins the presidency, it's more or less responsible for how well the president handles his or her job. The fifth and final function of political parties is to oppose the government. So we have running the government, but also opposing the government. The out party, the party that is out of power, the party that lost the last election, still has an important role to play within the government, and that is to be the loyal opposition. The out party, the party that's out of power, presents alternative policies to the policies presented by those in the majority. They also critique, criticize, and hold accountable the party in power by pointing out their mistakes, by questioning them, by challenging them. And that's a very important role to play in our democracy because, as Lord Acton would say, power corrupts. So you need to have a party out of power critiquing those in power. You need to have that in a democratic system. Otherwise, the people who are in power, if they're left unaccountable, they will almost always end up abusing their power in some way or another. So the role of loyal opposition, of playing the loyal opposition role, that is one of the most important things that a political party can do if they